Thor, a giant German shepherd, had taken to sleeping outside his booth in the snow. After 3 hours, his owner felt compelled to find out why. What he discovered inside was completely shocking. Andreas was startled when the giant German shepherd growled at him. He'd raised Thor from a puppy, and they had always been best friends. When he approached the dog's booth again, Thor reacted in exactly the same way, stepping between him and the kennel door, lifting his lip on one side, and growling softly, as if warning Andreas not to come any closer. The snow crunched beneath Andreas' feet as he stepped to one side. The moment he did, Thor stopped growling. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. "What have you got in there?" Thor wagged his tail and dropped his head, then walked over to Andreas to have his ears scratched. Andreas thought the confrontation was over, so he stepped to his right and approached the kennel again. But as he had done before, Thor stepped in front of Andreas and took on a warning posture. Andreas shook his head. He'd never known what went on in a dog's head. It was best to let it sort itself out. Whatever was in the booth was clearly important to Thor, so Andreas decided to let him have his fun and check again the following morning. All of this had started during the summer of the previous year. Andreas, a keen carpenter, had spent the last few weeks of fall building a spectacular kennel for Thor. It had a porch and ample space inside for the dog to shelter from the snow, which Andreas expected to start falling in early December. And that's exactly what happened. The temperature dropped, and the first snow fell. Thor instinctively understood that the structure Andreas had built was for him, and in no time, he had turned it into his personal haven. Thor had rearranged the blankets Andreas had laid out for him, and ate his meals on his own porch when Andreas brought out the bowl in the mornings and evenings. In Andreas' opinion, Thor was the most spoiled dog in all of Baltimore, perhaps even in the United States. That evening, Andreas peeked through the drapes in his bedroom, and sure enough, Thor was lying on the porch of his booth, his head resting on his front paws, but with his ears standing upright as if on guard. A light snow had been falling for about an hour, and Andreas took one last look before going to bed. Thor was still on the porch of his kennel. It was freezing outside, but he hadn't moved. This was really odd. Shortly after sunrise, Andreas walked out to the booth again. The previous night's snow had added at least 2 inches to the white carpet covering the property. Thor jumped to his feet when he saw Andreas, but when Andreas tried to make his way past the dog to the entrance of the kennel, Thor stepped in front of him again, just like the day before. The German shepherd looked at his master pleadingly, as if to say, "Please don't try it again." As soon as Andreas moved toward the entrance of the booth, Thor lifted his lip, and the soft growl followed. The dog was doing exactly what he had done the day before. He was trying to keep Andreas from looking inside the kennel. Andreas was completely flabbergasted. He had no idea what to make of Thor's strange behavior. But then he came up with a plan. He walked briskly through the snow to the kitchen door. Once inside, he took a slab of raw steak from the fridge and started chopping it into small cubes. This was Thor's favorite treat, and Andreas was sure the dog wouldn't be able to resist a bowl of chopped steak. The only challenge would be convincing Thor to come and eat it in the kitchen. With the bowl in hand, Andreas walked outside and over to the booth again. As before, Thor jumped up to greet him. Andreas crouched down and made a fuss of the dog, then produced the bowl from behind his back and let Thor smell it. The dog nearly jumped out of his skin. Nothing excited him as much as a bowl of freshly chopped steak. But when Andreas walked away with the bowl in hand and called for Thor, the dog sat down. This was unusual. He normally got his treats at his booth, and now his owner wanted him to follow him to the kitchen. Thor was torn. He looked over his shoulder at the booth and whined softly. Then, seemingly deciding that all would be fine for the next few minutes, he bounded after Andreas. In the kitchen, Andreas crouched again. The dog followed him inside, his eyes fixed on the bowl of steak. Part 1 of Andreas' plan had come together perfectly. He placed the bowl on the floor in the far corner of the kitchen and made a fuss of the dog again. Thor tucked in. He didn't try to gulp all the steak at once as most dogs would. Instead, he seemed to savor every bite. This had always fascinated Andreas. the way this German Shepherd relished his food. Now it was time for phase 2. Andreas got up slowly, walking backward toward the door, keeping his eyes on the dog. Thor paid him no attention. Andreas exited the kitchen and pulled the door shut behind him. Phase 2 was executed successfully. He started making his way to the kennel. Inside the kitchen, Thor had sensed the ruse the moment the kitchen door closed behind Andreas, and he wasn't happy, not at all. He barked twice, then seemed to understand that Andreas had tricked him. Thor scratched at the back door and whined urgently. When it was clear Andreas was ignoring him, he ran around to the lounge. The lounge had big windows, and Thor could see his booth from there. He saw Andreas walking toward it, and it upset him even more. He barked louder and jumped up against the window. Andreas heard the commotion inside and looked over his shoulder at the house. There was Thor, perched against the lounge window with his front paws, looking at him resentfully. Andreas didn't like the fact that he'd had to lure the dog inside and close him up. It felt like he was betraying his best friend, like he was breaking the bond of trust they'd built since Thor was a puppy. But he simply had to see what Thor was protecting inside his booth, and there was no way Thor would allow him close. Desperate situations called for desperate measures, he decided, and pressed on toward the booth. When he reached the kennel, Thor became frantic. For a few seconds, Andreas was sure Thor would break the glass and come crashing through the lounge window. The dog wasn't barking anymore. He was now snarling and growling in a highly agitated manner. His anger seemed to grow as Andreas approached the entrance of the booth. Andreas got on his hands and knees and put his head through the opening. He hadn't built windows into the booth, so it was quite dim inside. He got a whiff of the typical doggy smell and tried to look around in the low light. Then he reached out and took hold of one corner of Thor's blanket. When he pulled on it, he was greeted with a loud, fierce hiss. Andreas instinctively jumped back, his heart racing. His first thought was a snake, but it would have to be enormous to hiss that loudly and aggressively. Besides, it was winter, and the chances of encountering a snake were slim. Carefully, Andreas made another approach, holding his forearm in front of him to protect himself in case the creature decided to attack. He took hold of the blanket's corner again and slowly pulled it back. The hissing came again, louder and more aggressive. Hesitantly, Andreas pushed his head through the opening once more. This time he spotted it, a raccoon. For a moment, Andreas was confused. By all standards, a raccoon would typically flee, yet this one was standing its ground, just as Thor had done. It was defending something. Then Andreas saw it. First, he spotted one kit, or baby raccoon, then a second nestled in the folds of Thor's blanket, and then a third and a fourth. By the time he finished counting, there were 6. Andreas immediately understood. The mother raccoon needed a safe spot to give birth when the late snow began to fall, and Thor, the gentleman he was, had sacrificed his home for her and then proceeded to guard her, completely free of charge. Andreas couldn't help but smile. Thor, the loyal and gentle giant, had made an incredible sacrifice for the mother raccoon and her kids, sharing his space and even protecting them from his own owner. As the days turned to weeks, Andreas decided to create a cozy shelter for the raccoon family nearby, making a comfortable nest to ensure they had a safe place to stay. Thor, understanding the situation, reclaimed his kennel but always kept a watchful eye on them, ready to stand guard until they were ready to explore the world on their own. It's so great to see a story about goodwill between animals. Have you ever seen animals of different species taking care of each other? Tell us your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. But for now, we're out of here. Catch you in the next video.